Hello and welcome to the podcast of The Life Scientific, first broadcast on BBC Radio 4. I'm Jim Al-Khalili and my mission is to interview the most fascinating and important scientists alive today and to find out what makes them tick. No one wants to be told that their child isn't clever. To be told that, to a large extent, this is down to their genes can just make matters worse. But according to my guest today, leading psychologist Professor Robert Plomin, the evidence on the inheritance of intelligence is clear. Much as we like to think that good parenting and good teachers make all the difference, they don't. The most significant influence on academic achievement is written in our children's DNA. Born and raised in Chicago, Robert came to the UK in 1994. A year later, he launched the largest longitudinal twin study in the world, known to those in the know as the TED study. When all the twins had reached 16, he showed that GCSE grades are more nature than nurture. Professor Robert Plomin, welcome to the Life Scientific.
Thank you very much, Jim.
So, Robert, presumably the twins, all 10,000 pairs of them, have now done their A-levels. So what's the latest news?
Yes, well, we're very excited about this because no one studied A-levels before, and only half the students take A-levels. So I really didn't know how the results would come out. But in terms of the grades themselves, after 2 years of A-levels, it's much as we found in previous years. That is, most of the differences in children's performance can be attributed to DNA differences between them.
I mean, that's quite humbling. It's rather alarming, in fact, isn't it?
Absolutely.
All the work we can do in guiding the children, giving them advice, sending them to the right school, and it's already there, imprinted in their genes.
Yes. In the past, I've really hated to pit nature versus nurture because they are both important. But when you've got people so worried about, say, differences between schools, the league tables, that at most accounts for 20% of the differences between children in school achievement. Genetics accounts for well over half, maybe 2/3 of the differences. So at some point, I think you got to say, we're not talking about little effects here. We're talking about by far the biggest predictor of children's performance. And I think it's important for parents to get that message. And it's not to say you don't do anything. You give your kids the best possible shot at doing what they do and doing it well. But if parents think that their children are a blob of clay that they mold to be the way they want them to be, it's important for them to get this message.
I do want to talk to you a bit later about just how tricky it can be to disentangle nature from nurture. But first I wanted to find out a little bit about your nature and nurture. Being American, of course, you didn't get to do the British A-levels. But did you agonise over what subjects to study?
No, my life seems to be chance more than anything. It wasn't strategic. I grew up in a family where no one went to the university and we had very few books in our home. So I feel like it was chance, but the chance that worked for me was I went to the Catholic schools in Chicago, and they were very strict and disciplinarian. That was good because I needed it. But the other thing they did is that they did a lot of testing. And because of intelligence tests, they made it possible for me to go to this academy, which is like a specialized high school called DePaul Academy, which then led on to the university. And the neat thing was, being from a poor inner city family, there would be no money for these things, but it was all free. And by the time I got to university, not only was it free, they paid me to go. So being a scamming inner city kid, it sounded like a good deal to me. They paid me to go. And so I just did my education on the side while I worked.
Did heading off in this rather different direction to traditions of your family and community, did it make you feel somehow different from your parents? And you have had a sister as well who didn't go to university.
I had a sister who didn't go on either. It did make me feel odd, and I don't know if I should confess this, but I always read with envy J.D. Salinger's books on the Glass family. I wanted a family like that had intellectual discussions, and my family was lovely, and they were extremely supportive, wonderful parents, and I was able to get the environment I needed intellectually through school and books and friends, and when I went to university, and then especially when I went to graduate school.
But when you went to university, your initial choice of subject wasn't pure science, as it were, it was philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I was actually taking courses that fit my work schedule. I was working full-time. And I took film and English for a while, and then I kind of liked philosophy. But after a while, I came to realize I kept getting in trouble because I kept trying to come up with empirical tests. And I had this realization after about a year of this that if you can test it, it's no longer philosophy. And what is it? It's psychology. So at that moment, I just got up and left and became a psychology major.
Well, you pretty quickly then specialised in what was then quite a niche area, behavioural genetics. Why was that?
Well, unlike my choice of psychology, my choice of behavioral genetics was much more an example of caprice in a way. So I was going to go into law school to make lots of money, which is what an inner city kid does. But I had this advisor who thought I should try graduate school, and I didn't know what it was. He basically filled out applications for me, and I got this call from the University of Texas.
This is to do a PhD?
At Austin, to do a PhD. This is after, I was about to graduate. And they said the magic words, they'd pay me to go. And so I said, okay, I'll go to Austin, Texas. And they had a program, a general program in psychology, but they had a core curriculum that all graduate students had to take. They assume you know nothing, and they start all over again. They have you take all the major areas of psychology. Turns out that the University of Texas at Austin was the only place in the world where they had a course in behavioral genetics. They had most of the key players in animal and human behavioral genetics.
That's really niche then, isn't it?
Yeah. So,
and you liked it.
Well, that was an amazing thing. There were 40 new PhD students taking all these core courses. And I really don't know why 39 other students, thought it was an okay course, but no one went on to do behavioral genetics. And yet I just knew that that was what I was going to do the rest of my life. And why is that? And I wonder if part of it might not be my orneriness. Psychology didn't talk about genetics at all. And there might be that orneriness in me or stubbornness that said, wow, this is exciting. I mean, look at all the implications it could have if this is true. And how can you just totally ignore it? You're a scientist. You have to pay attention to data. And at that time, it was mostly animal behavioral data, but it was very powerful, where you can select for behaviors, which is kind of the proof of the pudding of genetic influence.
I wonder, at what point did you choose to study specifically intelligence?
Yeah, good question. I initially started out studying temperament, we called it, which is we defined as the more biological or genetic aspect of personality. And if you study the development of personality or temperament in children, you can't give them personality questionnaires. They can't read. So you had to come up with other ways to observe their behavior, to have their parents rate their behavior. But along the way, we started including tests of cognitive abilities to look at how the children respond to these situations in terms of their personality. But it turns out that the cognitive tests, the tests of mental ability, were so much more well-conditioned and more stable.
You mean consistency in the scores over time?
Yeah. Partly it was that it was a better trait to study. It was more tractable in a way. And I wonder, too, if it's not this orneriness coming through it. At that time, this was not a cool thing to be studying. It was very non-PC.
At what point in your career did you realize that studying the inheritance of intelligence was political dynamite?
Well, I had an eye-opening experience 2 years into my graduate school, which is about when I started to make this transition. I went to a meeting of the eastern portion of the American Psychological Association, and I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 people there. And the incoming president was a guy named Leon Kamen, who gave this plenary address, and he was saying there's this new field coming along that's trying to bring genetics into psychology. And it was very ad hominem, and the talk was rabble-rousing. And the rabble was getting roused. I looked around, and these people were, it's like going to be a witch hunt. And here I was, probably the only behavioral geneticist in the audience.
What sort of things were they saying?
He was basically saying people were making up their data, and there's no evidence for genetics, no evidence that a prudent man would accept for heritability of intelligence being other than zero.
I wonder whether deep down in your psyche that you knew in your heart, because of your experience, your background, you'd gone off to university, you were very different from your parents, from your sister, that it couldn't be zero, the effect of genetics.
Yeah, I guess we all have these hunches, and I'd done enough work, and there'd been animal work on learning in mice, for example. It's all consistent with there being genetic influence, but I think you're right that it's in part maybe my experience. The only reason I ended up at university was because of intelligence testing in this Catholic school in Chicago. And intelligence tests have since been forbidden in the United States, a real case of blaming the messenger. But I know that as intelligence tests were developed, particularly here in the UK, they were developed to pick out kids like me, the kids who wouldn't have had the social graces to do well in interviews and, who just...
This is, for example, the 11 plus here in the UK.
I don't know if I'm advocating that, but I would say that we need to do something to recognize children whose background wouldn't give them the leg up that they might need to get into the system.
Then in the 1990s, the whole field became toxic once again when Murray and Herrnstein published their infamous book, The Bell Curve, in which they established a link between genes and IQ, and then linked those IQ differences to racial differences.
And that's exactly what caused the problem with a book that came out by Arthur Jensen in 1969, where he just mentioned race. So race is an extremely tricky issue. I've ducked it my whole life, my whole career, because it doesn't explain much variance. So I'm more interested in studying individual differences because they're tractable. We have methods to address them. We don't have methods to understand what causes average differences between groups, whether they're boys and girls or races or classes.
But what I wanted to pick up on was that I know that you were one of 50 or so academics who signed a letter to the Wall Street Journal that endorsed the data in the book, though not the author's conclusions.
Yes.
But why would you do that?
Good question. I don't usually do that. And it was just, in a way, just to be totally honest, I was feeling bad that I had kept my head down all the time. And that was a point at which I felt it was important to stick my head above the parapet.
What was then the point you were trying to make when you say you ought to stick your head up above the parapet?
Yeah. Well, it's that I was really getting tired of psychologists just bashing anything genetic. And it was kind of like a frustration in a way, and just saying, you have to deal with the fact that genetics is important. In general, I felt softly is a better way to go, but I got a lot of flack from people in the field for being a wimp.
So there came a point when you just felt you had to stand up for your field.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue about personalities and politics at the time. Oh, it's a public understanding of science issue, but it's so complicated and so fraught. That's why I kept my head down for so many years. And,
have you regretted doing that since then?
Well, I regret it to the extent it's a distraction to my research. But I think the basic facts are there about heritability of intelligence. And it's just so unfortunate that some of the interpretations they made from that data are so, some of them are quite bizarre, and I would make just the opposite sorts of interpretations.
Clearly your chosen area of science is a political minefield. It's also difficult science, which is easily misunderstood. As I understand it, there are two main ways of trying to disentangle nature from nurture, and these are adoption studies and twin studies, and you've done both. You started with a big adoption study in Colorado, didn't you?
I did, yes. Up till that time, most of the work involved the twin method, which I think we'll get on to in a bit. And I wanted to use the adoption method because in a way it's more powerful and people understand it more easily. If you study children who are adopted away at birth from their birth parents, their biological parents, and then they're reared in adoptive homes, their adoptive parents share the family environment with those children, but they don't share genes. Their birth parents share genes with the children, but not the environment. So it really, with the social intervention of adoption, completely separates the nature and the nurture of parenting.
But in 1994, you moved to the UK, and a year later launched one of the biggest longitudinal twin studies of recent times, the Twins Early Development, or TED study, of over 10,000 pairs of twins, which has now been running for 2 decades.
That's right.
I'm doing my maths.
Mm-hmm.
How did it come about?
Again, it's fortuitous. A couple phone calls got me to the research director for the Office for National Statistics, as it was called then. And just the year before, I came in 1994, and in 93, they had just first started putting on the birth records whether it was a multiple birth or not. So, and they just then became computerized. So that made a search for identical twins extremely easy to do. So that project was off and running very quickly.
And as I mentioned back in the introduction, in 2013, when all the twins had reached the age of 16, you were able to look at their GCSE results. So what did you find there?
For GCSEs, what we found is that, as in all the previous years where we've been studying these children, that genetics accounts for more than half of the difference between children, and that this shared environment doesn't account for much, maybe 20% of the variance.
And when you say shared environment, you mean growing up in the same home, the same area, going to the same school, that sort of thing?
Yes, those are the most likely candidates for it, but what it is technically, it's the extent to which children growing up in the same family are similar for environmental reasons, not genetic reasons, because nature and nurture run in families, and the nurture part of it is this shared environment. And it seems likely to attribute it to parents and to schools and neighborhoods, peers, that sort of thing.
A lot of people might have read about that study and jumped to the conclusion that 60% of a child's brilliance is due to their genes, and roughly 40% is down to how they're brought up, what school they went to, and so on. Mm-hmm. But that's not what you're saying.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is probably the number one fallacy, is that if you say height is 80% or 90% heritable, it doesn't mean you and I grew to 80% of our height and the rest was due to the environment. We're always talking about differences called variance in a population.
Variance. Maybe you can define that.
Okay. Variance is just a statistic that describes individual differences. So I think everyone's used to the normal curve. Everything like height, weight, intelligence, reading ability, cholesterol levels, everything's distributed normally.
This is the bell curve.
The bell curve. Most people are in the middle, and as you go to the higher or lower end, there are fewer and fewer people. A statistic that describes that spread is variance.
So a large variance means a wide range, a wider distribution.
Right.
A small variance means everyone's the same.
Right. And what we're trying to do is to explain that variance.
We're talking about trying to explain the differences between children. How do you do that? How do twin studies help understand this?
Well, the twin method's like a natural experiment, whereas the adoption method's like a social experiment where you use adoption to separate biologically related people. The twin method's a natural experiment in the sense that about 1% of all births are twins, and there's two types of twins. 1/3 of them are what we call identical twins, monozygotic, a single fertilized egg that in the first 2 weeks of life separates and become clones of one another with the same DNA material. They're genetically identical. The other type of twins, 2/3 of all twins, are called dizygotic or non-identical twins. Di meaning two, zygotes, zygotic, dizygotic. And they, like any brother and sister, are 50% similar genetically. So the basis of the twin method is simply to say if a trait like height is influenced by DNA differences, then you'd have to predict that the identical twins, who are genetically identical, will be more similar in height than will the non-identical twins.
And in your study, for example, the GCSE results, you found that the identical twins got more similar results than the non-identical twins, concluding then that genetics is an important factor in determining grades.
Yes, that's right. And you can also then go on to estimate how much of the variance can be accounted for by genetic differences. And that's essentially by saying how much more similar are identical twins than non-identical twins.
One of the criticisms of twin studies is the difference in environment of identical twins and non-identical twins. That they are treated as though they have the same, if they're brought up together, they're treated as though they have the same environment. But it tends to be different if they're identical twins. Their shared experiences and how they develop.
Yes, for a long time, for 60, 70 years, people have talked about the main assumption of the twin method is the equal environments assumption. Is their environment the same? And this has been studied a lot, and in the end, we can conclude that the equal environments assumption is a safe one. Just one piece of data, identical twins reared apart. It's a dramatic finding. These are clones, they're reared in uncorrelated environments, and yet they're as similar as identical twins reared together. So it doesn't suggest that by being reared together, you're made to be more similar. And then there have been studies asking how are identical twins treated more similarly? Like, are they dressed alike more? Yeah. You can look at those things and ask how similar are they making the twins say, in terms of their educational achievement or intelligence, and not at all is the answer. So there's lots of ways that people have looked at it, but the most telling bit of data is the adoption method, which is a completely different method, has completely different assumptions, comes up with the same conclusion. So that's powerful in science to say, okay, here are the two different methods, each have problems, but they each come to the same conclusion. That makes you more comfortable with the conclusion. The ultimate test, though, will be when we find the actual DNA differences.
Given that genetics is such a fast-moving field at the moment, do you think that at some date in the future, the genetic evidence may actually prove to be rather less definitive than it seems now?
As I say, the ultimate test here will be to find the genes, and that's what people are doing now. We don't need more studies asking if intelligence or educational achievement is influenced by genetics, because it is. We know that, and all the data converge on that. But where the science has to go is towards finding these genes. And as is true of all the life sciences, it's difficult to find these genes because what we know from the last couple years is that there are no genes of big effect. We know that for sure. So it isn't a matter of trying to find the gene or even the handful of genes. We're talking about many, many genes, thousands perhaps, of very small effect.
Given that, there are thousands of genes that are involved in a particular attribute, for example, intelligence, how can you be confident that there is this causal link between the genetic information you gain and the things like GCSE results?
Well, DNA has unique causal status in science because all we inherit is DNA sequence. Nothing changes that DNA sequence. So if you correlate something with that definition of genetics and say reading ability or disability, it can't be that there's reverse causation. It can't be that the reading somehow caused the DNA difference. What's surprising is that those DNA differences affect complex traits like intelligence, even though we know there are so many steps in between in terms of gene expression and responses to the environment. So that's the real surprise, is that we can go from those DNA differences all the way out to complex behavior, skipping everything in the middle, and yet that correlation then implies that the differences we observe among these children, say in reading ability or intelligence, are caused by that DNA sequence variation.
The ultimate proof that this causal connection is there is to find those genes responsible.
Right. Absolutely, and that's the rub. In all the life sciences, not just for psychology or psychiatry, but for everything, all complex traits and common disorders, height, weight, everything. For all those traits and disorders, we're talking about many, many genes of small effect. And what that means is it's very difficult to find them because they have such small effect. You need huge samples to find them.
Have you found any yet?
Well, we're explaining maybe 1% of the variance right now using these polygenic scores. And you'd say, well, that's not much. We're not there yet, but we're beginning to get there. And the strategy for getting farther is really coming along. So genetics is very important, and without knowing the specific genes that are involved, there's a lot we can think about in terms of our educational policies.
How then can findings like this be of real use to education policymakers?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this evidence doesn't have any necessary policy implications. That is, you can take the heritability of learning ability or reading ability and come up with a right-wing sort of policy or a left-wing policy, because policy depends on values, not just knowledge. So with these data, if you had a right-wing policy, you could say, wow, here's a thing we could do that'd be very cheap. We can educate the best and forget the rest.
And that's what a lot of people are concerned about, that's how it might be used.
Could be, but that's because of those values. Now, I think that would be a dumb thing to do, because intellectual capital of a society now isn't just based on the 2 or 3 people who invent calculus or Google or something like that. It's really based on a broad range of intellectual capability of a society. But you could take a left-wing perspective on it and say, as the Finns did explicitly in their model, that you want to raise everybody up to a minimal level of literacy and numeracy no matter what it takes. But the point I'm trying to make is no necessary policy implications follow, because policy depends on values.
But does it worry you, though, that your findings could be used to develop educational policies and justify conclusions that you would profoundly disagree with?
It doesn't. That's why I try to get these messages out, that that's a matter of values, and the basic data doesn't necessarily dictate a policy like that. I think
But it does provide ammunition to politicians.
on the right or on the left, it depends on what values they apply to these data. But I don't see where that should be a reason for saying we should shut up and not talk about this stuff.
My concern, I mean, I see what you mean, but my concern will be that the very act of describing children's genetic weaknesses, say, would have a detrimental effect on how they're seen and in time maybe how they see themselves.
Possibly. That's the negative side of it. The positive side of it is that if kids are going to have problems, isn't it almost unethical not to try to find out about it?
In an ideal world, I agree with you, but I think in the real world, people will inevitably be making value judgments about this sort of information.
Well, then let me say again that it's science here. And as a scientist, I want to know what causes these differences. And I think a lot of good often comes out of basic science, and big discoveries like the fact that genetics is so important. People react against that. I understand that. But we are truth seekers.
Yes, you want to know the science. Yes, you want to understand the truth behind it. But there are clearly ethical issues that scientists have to be aware of in terms of how that data, how that information could be used.
Yeah, and I agree with you. We have to be sensitive to that. We have to do our best to mitigate those wrong interpretations. But I know there's a lot of doom mongers, and I'm going to be a cheerleader because I do think there's a lot of good that come out of this.
Yeah, but we can understand why people have avoided this subject for so long.
Well, I'm no longer being so tolerant about that. It's, time to get the message that genetics is important. If there are parents or teachers out there who think genetics isn't important, they're doing a disservice to their children and their students. They've got to recognize that it's a lot harder for some children to learn than others. And, that isn't a specific policy implication, but it's an important way of thinking about our children, our students, and ourselves. If you don't recognize that a lot of who you are has to do with genetics, you're kind of missing the boat. If you think it's all, like in psychoanalytic terms, due to your mother's breastfeeding and toilet training, I'm sorry for you.
You're a highly successful academic, one of the most highly cited psychologists in the world. To what extent does it feel to you as if this is simply the result of your genetic inheritance?
That's a good question. I guess I would have to say that I think I got a lucky combination of genes that, it has certainly helped me in my career. But it's funny how when we look at things scientifically, it's not necessarily the way we look at them when we're thinking about ourselves.
Robert Plomin, thank you very much for sharing your Life Scientific.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast of The Life Scientific. For more information or to listen to other episodes, please search for The Life Scientific on the Radio 4 website.